Chapter 4. This spring and summer not much was seen of the master at Huseby. At such times as he was at the manor, he and his wife met each other with courtesy and friendliness. Erland in no way tried to break down the wall she now built up between them, though he would often look after her searchingly. For the rest, he seemed to have much to think on outside his home. Touching the management of the estate, he never asked a single word. It was this matter of the estates his wife brought forward when, just after the spring Holy Cross Day, he would have had her go with him to Raumsdal. He had business in the uplands. Would she not take the children with her, stay a while at Jorengard and see her kinsfolk and friends in the dale? But Kristin would on no account agree to this. He was in Nidaros at the time of the Lagthing, and afterward out in Orkadal. Then he came home to Huseby, but at once busied himself making ready for a journey to Bjorgvin. Margeigren was lying out at Nidarholm, and he but waited for Hafthor Grout, who was to sail along with him. 3 days before Margaret's Mass they began the hay harvest at Huseby. It was the fairest weather, and when the haymakers went back to the meadows after the midday rest, Olaf, the foreman, got leave for the children to go with them. Kristin was in the clothing storehouse that was in the second story of the armoury building. The house was so built that an outer stairway led up to this room, which had a balcony before it. The third story, the armoury itself, stood out above the balcony, and it could be reached only by a loose ladder from the clothing loft leading to a trapdoor on the floor. The trapdoor was open, for Erland was up in the armoury. Kristin bore out the fur cloak that Erland was to take with him for the sea voyage, and shook it out on the balcony. Then she was aware of the noise of a great company of horsemen, and at the same moment she saw folks come riding out of the woods on the Galdal road. The next moment Erland stood by her side. "Was it right, Kristin, did you say, that the fire in the kitchen was put out this morning?" "Yes. Gudrid upset the broth cauldron. We must borrow a light from Sira Eilif." Erland looked across at the priest's house. "No, he must not be mixed up in this." "Gout," he called softly to the boy who was loitering under the balcony, lifting one rake after another, unwilling to set out to the haymaking. "Come up hither, up the stairs. No farther, or they might see you." Kristin gazed at her husband. She had never seen him like this before, the strained, alert calm in his voice, in his face as he spied out southward along the road, in the whole of his tall, supple form, as he ran into the loft and came back at once with a flat packet sewn up in linen cloth. He gave it to the boy. "Hide this in your breast, and mark well what I say to you. You must save these letters. More is at stake than you can understand, my gout. Put your rake over your shoulder and go quietly down across the fields till you come to the alder thickets. Keep well among the bushes till you get down to the wood. You know all the paths there, I think. And creep through the thickest brush all the way across to Skjoldverkstad. When you get there, make sure first that all is quiet on the farm. Should you see signs of anything amiss or of strangers about, then hide. Once you are sure all is safe, go down to the farm and give this to Ulf if he be at home. But if you cannot give the letters into his hands while you are sure that no one is near, burn them the moment you come by the wherewithal to do it. But be sure that both writing and seals are altogether burnt up, and that they may not come into any man's hands but Ulf's. God help us, my son. These are great matters to put in the hands of a boy 10 years old. The lives and welfare of many good men. Do you understand that much is at stake, Gout? Aye, father, I have understood all you have said to me. Gout looked up from the stairway, his little fair face full of earnestness. Say to Isaac, if Ulf is not at home, that he must ride straight out to Havner and on all night, and tell the ones he knows that a headwind has sprung up, and I fear me evil spells have spoiled my journey. Do you understand? Aye, father. I mind well all you have said to me. Go then. God keep you, my son. Erland ran up into the armoury and would have closed the trapdoor, but Kristin was already halfway through the opening. He waited till she was up, then shut the trap, ran over to a chest and took out some written parchments. He tore the seals off and trampled them to pieces on the floor, tore the parchments into rags and wrapped them together around the key of the chest, and dropped the little bundle from the window hole into the middle of the nettles that grew high behind the storehouse. With his hands on the window frame, he stood gazing after the little boy walking along the edge of the cornfield down towards the meadow, where the mowers were moving forward in a line, plying their scythes and rakes. When Gout disappeared into the little copse between the cornfield and the meadow, he closed the shutter. The noise of hoofbeats came loudly now, and from nearby. Erland turned towards his wife. Can you make disappear what I just threw out but now? Send Skill, he has his wits about him. Tell him to fling it down into the pit behind the byre. They will probably keep an eye on you, and perhaps on the big boys too, but they will scarce search you. He put the fragments of the seals down inside the bosom of her dress. None could make them out, I think, but yet... Are you in peril, Erland? She asked quietly. When he had looked into her face, he drew her outspread arms around him. For a moment he pressed her to him. I don't know, Kristin. We shall soon see, I think. Tor Eindridsen rides at the head of the men, and Sir Bard is with them, if I saw aright. I can scarce believe that Tor comes hither for my good. The horsemen were in the courtyard now. Erland stood still a moment. Then he kissed his wife vehemently, opened the trapdoor and ran down. When Kristin came out into the balcony, she saw Erland in the courtyard helping the treasurer, who was an old man and heavy, to dismount from his horse. There were 30 men-at-arms at least, with Sir Bard and the warden of Galdola County. As Kristin crossed the yard, she heard the warden say, I bring you greetings from your cousin, Erland. Borgar and Guttorm Tronsons are the king's honoured guests at Vioi, and I think Haftor Torresson will have paid a friendly visit by this time to Ivar and the young lad at their home at Sundbu. Sir Bard took Haftor Grout into keeping in the city yestermorn. And now I see you are come hither to bid me to this same meeting of the guardsmen, said Erland, smiling. So it is, Erland. And doubtless you want to search my manor here too. Oh, I've done my part in such affairs so often that I ought to know the way it is done. Such great affairs as high treason you have scarce been involved with before, said Tor. No, not before now, said Erland, and it looks as though I were playing with the black men, Tor, and you had mated me. Is that not so, kinsman? We must find forth the letters you have had from Lady Ingeborg Hakonsdatter, said Tor Eindridsen. They are in the chest covered with red leather up in the armoury. But there is not much in them, save such greetings as dear kinsfolk used to send to each other, and they are all old. Stein here can take you up. The stranger horsemen had dismounted now, and the housefolk were come crowding into the courtyard. There was more in the one we took from Borgar Tronson, said Tor. Erland whistled softly. We had best go into the hall, he said. It's beginning to get crowded out here." Kristin followed the men into the hall. At a sign from Tor, 2 of the stranger men-at-arms came with them. "You must give up your sword, Erland," said Tor of Gimsar, when they stood inside, "for a sign that you are our prisoner." Erland smote his thighs to show that he wore no other weapon than the dagger in his belt. But Tor said again, "You must give us your sword as a token." "Yes, yes, if it is all to be done to such a nicety," said Erland, laughing a little. He went over and took his sword from its peg, and holding the scabbard, held out the hilt to Tor Eindridsson with a little bow. The old man of Gimsar loosened the fastenings, drew the blade right out, and ran his fingers along its groove. "Was it this sword, Erland, that you—" Erland's blue eyes glittered like steel. His mouth grew narrow and straight-lipped. "Yes, it was with this sword I chastised your grandson when I found him with my daughter." Tor stood holding the sword. He looked down at it and spoke threateningly. "You that should uphold the law, Erland, you must sure have known that time you went a little farther than the law would follow you." Erland threw back his head, flushing, and said hotly, "There is a law, Tor, that cannot be set aside by kings or thingmen. His women's honour a man may guard with the sword." "It is well for you, Erland Nicolausson, that no man has put that law to use against you," answered Tor of Gimsar malignantly. "Else you will have need of as many lives as a cat." Erland said with stinging slowness of speech, "Don't you think this matter is so grave that 'tis untimely to mix it up with old stories from my youth? I don't know if Thorolf of Lensvik thinks these matters are so old." Erland flamed up and would have answered, but Tor shouted, "You should try first, Erland, whether your mistresses have skill to read writing before you run about to nightly trysts with secret letters in your waistband. Ask Bard there who it was that warned us that you were hatching traitorous counsels against your king that you have sworn troth to, and hold your place in fee from." Unwittingly, Erland raised a hand to his breast. He glanced for a moment at his wife, and his face flushed darkly. Then Kristin ran forward and threw her arms about his neck. Erland looked down into her face. He saw nothing in it but love. "Erland, husband!" The treasure had scarce spoken a word up to now. Now he went over to the pair and said softly, "Dear lady, perhaps it would be best that you take the children and your serving women with you into the women's house, and stay there as long as we are on the manor." Erland loosed his wife with a last pressure of his arm about her shoulders. "It is best so, my own Kristin. Do as Sir Bard counsels." Kristin lifted herself on tiptoe and offered him her mouth to kiss. Then she went out into the courtyard, and out of the confused throng of folk she gathered together her children and serving women, and carried them with her into the little hall. Other women's house there was not at Huseby. For some hours they sat there, and the mistress's calm and steadfastness kept the frightened little company's terror somewhat in check. Then Erland came in, disarmed and clad as for a journey. 2 stranger men-at-arms took post down by the door. He took his eldest sons by the hand, and then lifted the little ones in his arms, while he asked where Gout was. "But you must greet him from me, Narkby. He's run off to the woods with his bow, I warrant, as is his wont. Tell him he can have my English longbow after all. I denied it to him when he asked for it on Sunday." Kristin crushed him to her without a word. "When will you come back, Erland dearest?" she whispered pleadingly. "That must be as God wills, my wife." She drew back from him, struggling that she might not break down. When he spoke to her, he always used her christened name, and these last words of his shook her to the very heart. It was as if only now she understood to the full what it was that had happened. At the sunset hour, Kristin sat up on the hill north of the houses. She had never seen the sky so red and golden before. Above the hill right over against her lay a great cloud. It was shaped like a bird's wing. It glowed within like iron in the forge. It shone clear as amber. Little golden wisps like feathers loosed themselves from it and floated out into the sky. And deep below on the lake in the valley bottom, the sky was mirrored with the cloud and the hillside above it. It seemed as though it were from down there in the depths that the burning glow streamed up to tinge all that lay before her. The grass in the meadows was seeding, and its silken spikes shone darkly red in the red light from the sky. The barley was in ear and caught the radiance of its young, silky bright beards. The turf house roofs of the manor were thick with sorrel and buttercups, and the sunlight lay in broad rays across them. The blackish shingles of the church roof glowed darkly, and the light stones of the walls were softly gilded. The sun broke forth beneath the cloud, rested on the mountain crest, and sent his light out over range behind range of wooded hills. The evening was so clear. The light showed up to the sight little clearings among the pine-covered hillsides. She could see satyrs and little farms in among the woods that she had never before known one could see from Huseby. Great hill masses, deep violet in hue, rose in the south toward Dover, where else there were wont to be clouds or haze. The least of the bells in the chapel below began to ring, and the church bell at Vinjar answered. Kristin sat bowed over her folded hands till the last of the 3 triple strokes died away on the air. Now the sun was below the mountain top, the golden radiance grew paler, and the red more rosy and soft. After the bells had fallen silent, the sighing of the woods seemed to grow again and spread abroad. The noise of the little beck that ran through the leaf woods down in the valley sounded louder on the ear. From the close nearby came the well-known clinking from the bells of the home cattle. A flying beetle hummed halfway round about her and was gone. She sent a last sigh after her prayers, a prayer for forgiveness because her thoughts had been elsewhere while she prayed. The great manor lay below her on the hillside, like a jewel on the hill's broad bosom. She looked out over all the lands that she had owned along with her husband. Thoughts of this estate, cares for it, had filled her mind to the brim. She had worked and striven. Never till tonight had she known herself how she had striven to set this manor on its feet and keep it safe. Nor all she had found strength to do, and how much she had done. She had taken it as her lot to be borne patiently and unflinchingly, that all this rested on her shoulders. Even so, she had striven to be patient, and to hold her head high under the burden her life laid on her. Each time she knew she had again a child to bear under her heart, again and again. With each son added to the flock, she had felt more strongly the duty of upholding the welfare and safety of the house. She saw tonight, too, that her power to overlook the whole, her watchfulness, had grown with each new child she had to watch and strive for. Never had she seen so clearly as this evening what fate had craved of her and what it had granted her in giving her these 7 sons. Over and over again had joy in them quickened the beating of her heart. Fear for them pierced it. They were her children, these great lads with their lean, angular boys' bodies. As they had been when they were so small and plump, they could scarce hurt themselves when they tumbled in their journeys between the bench and her knee. They were hers, even as they had been when, as she would lift one of them from the cradle up to her breast for milk, she had to hold up its head because it nodded on the slender neck as a bluebell nods on its stalk. Wherever they might wander out in the world, However they might fare, forgetful of their mother, she felt as though for her their life must still be an action of her life. They must still be as one with herself as they had been when she alone in all the world knew of the new life which lay hidden within and drank of her blood and made her cheeks pale. Over and over again she had endured the sickening, sweating terror when she felt now her time was come again. Now again was she to be dragged under in the breakers of travail, till she was borne up again with a new child in her arms. How much richer and stronger and braver with each child. Never till tonight had she understood. And yet she saw tonight that she was still the Kristin of Lavransdatter, who had never learned to endure an ungentle word, because she had been shielded all her days by so strong and tender a love. In Erlend's hands she was still the same. Yes, yes, yes. It was true. She had gone on, storing up, year in, year out, the memory of every wound he had dealt her. Though she had known always that he had wounded her not from ill will as a grown man wounds another, but as a child strikes his playfellow in their play. She had tended the memory of each time when he had offended her, as one tends a festering sore. And every abasement he had brought upon himself by following his own every whim struck her like a whip-stroke on the flesh and left a running wheel. It was not so that she willingly and of purpose stored up grudges against her husband. She knew that towards others she was not petty-minded, but where he was concerned she grew so straight away. When Erlend was in question, she could forget nothing, and every least scratch on her soul went on smarting and bleeding and swelling and throbbing, when it was he that had dealt it her. Towards him she never grew wiser, never stronger. She might strive to seem in her life with him too, capable and brave and strong and pious, but it was not true that she was so. Ever, ever, longing gnawed within her, the longing to be again his Kristin of the woods of Gerderud. In those days she had been willing to do all that she knew was evil and sinful rather than lose him. To bind Erlend to her, she had given him all that was hers. Her love and her body, her honour and her part in the salvation of her Lord. And she had given him what she could find to give that was not hers, her father's honour and his trust in his child. All that wise and prudent grown men had built up to safeguard a little maid in her nonage, she had overturned. Against their plans for the welfare and advancement of their race, against their hopes that their works would bear fruit when they themselves lay under the mould, she had set her love. Much more than her own life had she staked in the game, wherein the sole prize was Erlend Nikolausson's love. And she had won. She had known from the time when he kissed her for the first time in the garden by Höfvin, even till today when he kissed her in the little hall before he was led away a prisoner from his home, Erlend loved her as his own life. And if he had not guided her life well, yet had she known well nigh from the first hour she met him how he guided his own. If he had not ever dealt well by her, yet he had dealt better by her than with himself. Jesus, how she had won him! She confessed to herself this evening. She herself had driven him to breach his marriage vows, by her coldness and by her venomous words. She confessed to herself now, even in these years when she had looked on, time and again, at his unseemly dalliance with this woman Sunniva, and had been angered by it. She had felt in the midst of her wrath a haughty and defiant joy. No one knew of any open stain on Sunniva Olavsdatter's honour, yet Erlend talked and jested with her as a serving man might with an alehouse wench. And of Kristin he had known, that she could lie and betray those that trusted her best, that she willingly let herself be lured to the most shameful places. Yet had he trusted her, yet had he honoured her so far as in him lay. Easy as it was for him to forget all fear of sin, easy as it had been for him to break his promise to God made at the altar, yet had he sorrowed over his sins against her, and had struggled for years that he might be able to keep his promises to her. She had chosen him herself. She had chosen him in a frenzy of love, and she had chosen anew each day of those hard years at home at Jorengard, chosen his wild, reckless passion before her father's love that would not suffer the wind to blow ungently upon her. She had thrown away the lot her father had shaped for her, when he would have given her to the arms of a man who would surely have led her by the safest ways, and would have stooped down to boot to take away each little stone that she might have dashed her foot against. She had chosen to follow the other, whom she knew was straying in perilous paths. Monks and priests had pointed the way of repentance and atonement to lead her home to peace, but she had chosen turmoil rather than let slip her darling sin. So, there was but one way for her, not to murmur or cry out whatever should befall her at this man's side. Dizzily far behind her it seemed now, the time when she had left her father, but she saw his beloved face, remembered his words that day on the smithy when she dealt his heart the last stab, remembered their talk together up in the mountains in the hour when she saw that the door of death stood ajar waiting for him. It is unworthy to murmur at the lot one has chosen for oneself. Holy Olaf, help me now, that I may not show myself altogether unworthy of my father's love. Erland, Erland. When she met him in her youth, life had become for her a swift river, rushing over rocks and rapids. In these years at Huseby life had spread out, lying wide and ample like a lake, mirroring all that surrounded her. She remembered at home when the Lagan overflowed in springtime and lay grey and mighty in the valley bottom, bearing on its bosom the driftage that came floating, while the tops of the growing leaf trees in its course swayed on the waters. Out in its midst showed little dark threatening eddies where the current ran swift and wild and perilous under the shining surface. Now she knew that even so had her love for Erland run like a swift and perilous current beneath the surface of her life through all these years. Now it was bearing her forward to what she did not know. Erland, beloved! Once more Kristin breathed out an Ave into the evening glow. Hail Mary, full of grace, I dare pray thee but for one mercy, that I see now. Save Erland, save my husband's life. She looked down at Huseby and thought of her sons. Now, when the manor lay there in the evening light, like a dream vision that might melt away, now that fear for her children's doubtful fate shook her heart, it came to her mind. Never had she thanked God fully for the rich fruits her toil had borne in these years, and never had she thanked him as she ought that 7 times he had granted her a son. Out of the dome of the evening heaven, from all the countryside beneath her eyes, came the murmured words of the Mass that she had heard thousands of times in her father's voice, that had set forth the words for her when she was a little child at his knee. Thus sings Sira Eirik in the Prefatio, when he turns to the altar, and thus it says in the Norse tongue, It is truly meet and just, right and available to salvation, that we should always and in all places give thanks to Thee, O Holy Lord, Father Almighty, Eternal God. When she lifted up her face from her hands, she saw Gart coming up the hill. Kristin sat still and waited till the boy stood before her. Then she stretched out her hand and took his. There was a grassy sward a good way round the stone where she was sitting, with no place where any might hide. "How did you do your father's errand, my son?" she asked softly. "As he bade me, mother. I came to the farm so that no one saw me. Ulf was not at home, so I burned what father had given me on the hearth fire in the hall. I took it out of the cloth." He hesitated a little. "Mother, there were 9 seals to it." "My gout." The mother moved her hands up till they rested on the boy's shoulders and looked into his face. "Your father has had to lay great matters in your hands. If you think that you cannot remain silent, then tell your mother what is weighing on you. But best of all, I would like it if you could altogether be silent, my son." The light-hued face under the smooth flaxen hair, the great eyes, the full, firm red mouth. How like he was to her father now. Gout nodded. Then he laid an arm on his mother's shoulder. Sweetly and sorrowfully it came on Kristin that now she could lean her head against the boy's spare little breast. He was so tall now that when he stood and she sat, her head reached to just above his heart. So for the first time it was she that leaned against her child. Gout said, "Isaac was alone at home. I didn't show him what I was bearing, but said only that I had something I must burn. So he made up a big fire on the hearth before he went out to saddle his horse." His mother nodded. Then he let go of her, turned towards her and said with childish awe and wonder in his voice, "Mother, do you know what they say? They say that father would have been king." "It doesn't sound likely, my boy," she answered with a smile. "But he is of kingly birth, mother," said the boy earnestly and proudly. "And I think father would be fitter to be a king than most men." "Hush!" She took his hand again. "My Gout, you must understand, now that father has shown such trust in you. You and we all must say or think nothing, but must watch our tongues well till we have learnt something, so that we can judge whether and how we should speak. I will ride to Nidaros tomorrow, and if I come to speech with your father alone at any time, I shall surely tell him that you have done his errand well." "Take me with you, mother," begged the boy vehemently. "We must not let anyone think, Gout, that you are anything else other than a thoughtless child. You must try, little son, to play about here at home and be as joyful as you can. In that way will you serve your father best." Nakvi and Bjorgulf came slowly up the hill. They came up to their mother and stood there, their young faces strained with feeling. Kristin saw that they were still so far children that they took refuge with their mother in this disquietude, and yet were come so far towards manhood that they would fain have comforted her and heartened her if they could but find the way. She held out a hand to each of the boys, but not much was said between them. Soon after they all went down, Kristin with a hand on the shoulder of each of her 2 eldest sons. "Why do you look at me that way, Nakvi?" But the boy grew red, turned away his head and made no answer. He had never before thought about his mother's looks. It was many a long day since he had begun to compare his father with other men. His father was the most comely of them all, and the most like a chieftain. His mother was the mother that had new children, who, as they grew from out the hands of the women, joined the little troop of brothers to share its life in fellowship, its friendship and its strife. Mother had open hands through which flowed all that they needed. Mother knew what to do for well-nigh all ills. Mother was like the fire on the hearth. She bore the life of the home as the lands round about Huseby bore the crops year by year, Life and warmth streamed from her as from the cattle in the byre or the horses in the stalls. The boy had never thought of likening her to other women. This evening he saw all at once. She was a proud and fair lady. With the broad white forehead under the linen coif, the steel grey eyes, straight gaze under the calmly arched brows, with the heavy bosom and the long, shapely limbs. She bore her tall body straight as a lance. But he could not speak of this. He walked on, flushed and silent, with her hand upon his neck. Gaut walked behind Björgulf and held by his mother's belt. The elder brother began grumbling because Gaut was treading on his heels. The two set to pushing and scuffling a little. The mother stopped the quarrel and bade them be quiet, and, so doing, her grave face softened into a smile. After all, they were but children, her sons. Kristin lay awake at night. Munin was sleeping at her breast, and Lavrans between her and the wall. She tried to come to some judgment of her husband's case. She could not believe the peril could be so great. Erling Vidkundsen and the king's cousin at Suderheim had been charged with disloyalty and treason, yet they were back at their homes now, as safe and as rich as ever, though they stood not so high as before in the king's favour. 'Twas like that Erland had engaged in some unlawful courses to serve Lady Ingeborg. In all these years he had kept up the friendship with his noble kinswoman. She knew that he had given her some sort of unlawful aid that had to be kept secret 5 winters ago when he was her guest in Denmark. Now that Erling Vidkundsen had taken up the lady's cause, and would have put her in possession of the estates she owned in Norway, it might well be that Erling had counselled her to go to Erland, or that she had turned to her father's kinsman of her own accord, after Erling had made his peace with the king, and that Erland had dealt foolhardily with the matter. But she could not well understand how her kinsfolk at Sundbu could be mixed up in this. Yet 'twas impossible that the end of the matter would be anything other than that Erland came to full atonement with the king, if all his offence was to have been too zealous in the king's mother's service. High treason! She had heard of Audun Hestakorn's downfall, and his death on the gallows at Nordnes. It was in her father's youth that it befell. But frightful deeds had been charged against Sir Audun. No, she would not think on such things. It was so little likely that Erland's cause should have a worse outcome than Erling Vidkundsen's and the Haftorsons, for example. Nicolaus, Erland's son of Huseby. Ah, now it seemed so to her too. Huseby was the fairest manor in Norway's land. She would go to Sir Bard and find out all that could be known. The treasurer had always been her friend. Olaf Lagman too, in former days. But Erland had taken it in such bad part when the Lagman's decree went against him in that suit about the townhouse. And Olaf had taken so much to heart the mischance that had befallen his goddaughter's husband. Near kinsfolk they had none, either Erland nor she, widespread as their kindred was. Munin Bardson scarce counted any more. He stood condemned for unlawful dealings when he held the wardenship of Ringerike. He sought too eagerly to get his many children on in the world. 4 he had had in wedlock, and 5 outside it, and 'twas said he had fallen away much since Lady Katrin's death. Inge of Ryfylke, Julita and her husband, Ranrid, who was married in Sweden, knew but little of Erland. These were the other children left by Lady Ashild. Between the Hestnes folk and Erland there had been no friendship since Sir Bard Peterson died. Tormod of Rasvold was in his 2nd childhood. His and Lady Gunnar's children were dead, and their grandchildren still in their nonage. She herself had no other kin on her father's side in Norway than Ketil Asmundsson of Skog, and Sigurd Koning, who was wedded to Asmund's eldest daughter. The other daughter was a widow, and the third a nun. The men of Sundbu seemed to be all four of them mixed in the case. The sick monk in the preacher's cloister was Erland's only near kinsman, and the man who stood nearest to her in the world was Simon Dar, since he was wed with her only sister. Munin awoke, whimpering. Kristin turned in her bed and laid the child to her breast on the other side. She could not take him with her to Nidaros, uncertain as all things were. Maybe this would be the last time this little one would drink from his own mother's breast. Maybe this would be the last time in this world that she should lie thus, holding a little child close to her, so blissfully, so blessedly. If Erland's life were forfeit, Blessed Mary, Mother of God, had she on any day or in any hour murmured by reason of the children God had granted her? Would this be the last kiss she should ever have from such a little milky mouth as this?